Okay, so we're going to move on now to the presentation of the project that won the President's Bronze Medal for the best design work produced in the course of RIBA Part 1 qualification or equivalent. The project is called Flow 1944, and it was produced by Simon Dean from Kingston University. Simon.
I was just thinking that Jasper's dissertation is almost a perfect companion to have today, simply because we're talking about very, very similar things. We're both addressing the landscape and they're sort of they're echoing each other, I believe, and it's really lovely to sort of you know, having heard such a wonderfully eloquent presentation before mine is just really sort of fortunate thing. So Flow 1944 is an exploration of geology and landscape around Mount Vesuvius in Naples. And as my sort of brain increases, I think it would be good to start talking about sort of the history of which is sort of condensed in this image. I mean, this really just shows you a very limited sort of section of all the eruptions that have, or at least the major eruptions that have been occurring since 1631, which was the sort of, in recent memory, the most destructive one. And the way I've sort of picked out the very latest eruption, so the one in 1944, was sort of the base for my thesis. So really there's this sort of chronology of events spanning centuries. And it's sort of, it's wonderful to be able to look at all these images in sequence and see how they relate to each other, and have sort of a very, very small detail of a massive painting by Tuomey sort of at the bottom, and then at the top, all these American bombers that were stationed around Vesuvius during the Second World War, which sort of took to the air to relocate to another base before they were completely sort of decommissioned by ash. Also looking at the towns that exist around Vesuvius. Obviously there are sort of towns that are way closer to the cone than sort of the city of Naples, and how they've sort of vanished out of existence in the span of just a few days or weeks, and have never sort of, they don't have the sort of prominence of Pompeii and Ocolana, which have been sort of, you know, gone around the world as these examples of extreme manifestation of nature's power, and sort of these tragedies with all these bodies. You know, these towns were just sort of quietly erased. Everyone evacuated, and there wasn't such a sort of aggressive eruption, so they just sort of silently crept into sort of not existing anymore. And this is an area it's not exactly adjacent to Vesuvius. It's actually across the Bay of Naples. It's Phlegarium fields, and it's just generated this sort of imagery that's been sort of been replicated across the years. It's actually quite funny, because then illustrations from 2-3 centuries later seem to sort of repeat themselves, and it's just sort of the presence of these places around a place like Naples that is really quite extraordinary. This, for many centuries, was thought to be sort of somewhere hidden in these fields was the gates to hell, because it's just the land that is that rises and then falls back with sort of the fluctuations and the pressures of the magma beneath it, and it always has this sulphurous sort of rotten egg smell to it, and pits of boiling mud. So really it's just sort of all these things that right now aren't commonly associated to Naples. It's sort of seen as barely a tourist attraction, and it's sort of things echoing from the past that I thought about, you know, that they need to be somehow part of this discourse. The images I was showing earlier of this town, San Sebastiano, one of the sort of half a dozen towns that were at least partially or completely destroyed by lava, lies sort of in this area. The bits where you see sort of these octagonal, hexagonal shapes is where that used to be, and now it's just become this sort of rejected landscape. These shapes that you actually see are dumps. So when you go and visit this place, you can see this extraordinary vegetation that's sort of really thriving in the very rich topsoil, this ash that's allowed these plants to, over the course of 70 years, just really sort of completely conceal any trace of the eruption, except where there's a sort of crack in the rock, as you can barely see in this image, but yeah, towards the lower left, you see the actual thickness of the rock. And what I was saying about it's sort of very timidly inhabited, so small enclosures for animals, private orchards, dump sites. So that's sort of this difficult interface between urban sort of outskirts of Naples and Vesuvius. And so my project began when I actually got back from Naples, and I was looking at satellite images just to sort of look at because the original intention was to sort of renovate the experience of going up to the cone of Mount Vesuvius, because as most sort of natural sites nowadays, they're sort of being completely contaminated by shacks and souvenirs, so there was a lot of potential for just sort of removing that and making it a more meaningful experience. But then, you know, in the satellite images, I saw this sort of grey mark coming down the volcano, which is completely hidden from the road going up to the cone, and I didn't remember, I can't remember seeing it when I was on the rim of the crater, so I thought, this looks interesting, it's intriguing. Obviously it's a very physical mark of an eruption that's still quite fresh. And so I decided that I needed to go back, so the whole, so in January I just took a cab to the edge of sort of current day San Sebastiano, which lies just a bit lower where the image is cut, and then just walked through all the dumps and up the flow, which is sort of this quite amazing walk. And I was just sort of transported to an image from late 19th century and what it looks like now. And it's just sort of being there was just an incredible experience, and it's what really brought together all these smaller echoes that I've been picking up before my trip, and it sort of started coalescing with other things that speak about memory and murmurs of the past. So Andrea Posti was a massive influence when sort of setting these themes, and obviously the extraordinary sort of similarity between some of the spaces that he finds, invents in his films, and what I sort of came upon when I got to the top of the volcano. So let's actually begin talking about the project and sort of what themes influenced it. So I'd like to go back to Pompeii, not because of the city, but more because of the remains that we have. And these images are very famous, these sorts of bodies that have been sort of preserved in sort of extraordinary detail. And actually it's the process in which these were made that's quite gruesome, but somehow it sort of, it has a relationship to the ash and the layering of the landscape. So the way these were made was when these people unfortunately and horribly suffocated during the eruption, because there's sort of this explosion and this wave of hot ash and gases. Very fine particles of ash started depositing over the bodies, sort of covering all the details in the sort of complexion. And then what happened is that the heat and the pressure of all these meters of ash above them completely cooked out the flesh and left completely hollow, sort of cast of their body. And it's this process that that was actually echoing with things that I was doing in parallel to starting the design project. So, for instance, a warm-up study that I was doing at Palm House in Kew Gardens, where I was sort of analysing, let's say, the flesh inside Palm House. So it's a conservatory, it contains all these exotic species of plants, and sort of surveying these things and expressing them, you know, in drawings and then in volume, rebuilding this to scale, and then throwing plaster into a box containing these sort of volumes. And sort of this, as soon as I came back from the field trip, I thought, isn't this a wonderful sort of parallel, the way this helps me sort of move towards an attitude towards building in the landscape, rather than sort of just laying something that's expendable. It's something that's an open vessel, ready for further eruption. So really is strong images of quarries shot by Edward Wojtyński, an American photographer, that just sort of jump-started this process of building a vocabulary. And the way the proposal is just an analysis of this landscape and then a very response. So being on site, measuring, you know, coming back to the studio, interpreting this information, slowly sort of going from drawings to physical models. And so the idea of a bathhouse on Mount Vesuvius is really just an aggregation of pre-existing conditions on the site. So you have this extraordinarily thick layer of rock that's absolutely perfect for carving, but then you have all these other things happening around it. So water trapped between the layer between this sort of flow, the one prior to it, and obviously the geothermal activity in the area, and all these clues just came together to what is essentially a reinterpretation of a Roman bathhouse. Again, going back to images of quarries, building up a vocabulary of how this would be done, simply because I don't imagine it as something that's a sort of an industrial way of quarrying, but it's more of listening to the rock, seeing where there might be a fault line, and that's how you define the space, really. So it's not only responding to the topography, but also to just sort of the workers being on site, you know, just letting the process of excavation shape the spaces. And strong echoes to, again, another extraordinary part of Naples that isn't typically known, which is the fact that Naples is built above a massive deposit of tufa rock. It's a very soft, porous rock that has been excavated since even before Greek times. And over millennia, there's just been a continuous excavation beneath the city, not only to excavate rock for construction, but also providing water reservoirs, burial sites, etc. And so all these things really coalesce into sort of making a case for this actually being possible, and also looking at the Lalibela churches in Ethiopia and how the information that's been produced from studying them, because the technology available to Ethiopians in the 12th century was very similar to what you'd be using to quarry this rock, and so how their techniques overlap with modern sort of topographical analysis that's been done by sort of the Vesuvius monitoring official sort of branch of the government. And sort of all these things that I've been talking about really just come very simply, just sort of come together into generating the spaces that I created for in this project. And really it's just responding to what's happening above ground, but also below ground. Just really finding, listening very closely to what is going on, and then making spaces out of it. So the plans just show a bit of how maybe the program and the sequence wasn't sort of directly taken from let's say the Roman precedent of the bathhouse, but as sort of my picking of details that aren't necessarily geographically very close. This is again sort of looking into other precedents of bathing in very far sort of parts of the world. So Byzantine bathhouses and Japanese center, and how these sort of I borrowed from several different sources to make something that would be sensible to do up in the volcano, simply because the modern spa bathhouse is something that's heavily serviced, and this is more about just doing something with the means available, rather than sort of placing a very sort of robust mechanism that would be needed to be sustained by sort of external means. And it's just really the creation of just a few pools and these long cuts in the ground that sort of span north to south. So throughout the year, the different pools and the different ski rooms switch around and program changes according to weather and to sort of external conditions. In this section it shows part of the sort of built, what I actually was calling building, but sort of, I don't see a disparity between the sort of quarrying aspect, that they're both ways of making space, but it was just the use of sort of concrete and just to pour a floor and create a channel in which to run surfaces, but it's also just a way of sort of making ground, rather than it's a delicate interface between sort of the way you make concrete, because it's actually quite extraordinary that it's the place where the material used to create a Roman concrete, so the Roman forum and other such buildings is very close to Mount Vesuvius. It's hot stone, which is ground into dust. It comes from Pozzuoli, it's just a few kilometers away. And so it's that sort of, again, using things that are already on the site. So concrete is a natural thing to use, simply because you can grind up most of this stuff and use it as a substitute of cement. And that's also done nowadays to make lighter mixes. So really, yeah, you can see in the previous image, you see like these sharper lines of me building a few necessary spaces as storage and also places for visitors to eat as part of their sort of journey through Vesuvius. This is seen as something as a little station on the top of the volcano that's part of a long adventure in the landscape. And this really brings me to a slightly invisible part of the project, because up to now the focus has been on space making and on sort of let's say very physical and quite literal interaction with the landscape. But I think one of the things that I would like to explore, and maybe this doesn't happen in this particular case, because there's examples just this is another slide from another Tarkovsky film, and it's about the layers of the land moving parallel to memory and to inhabitation. So really, the way this project is conceptualized is as I'd say just a moment in time. It's sort of one layer of rock, and that's just one construction that's being sort of made, and then I imagine subsequent eruption lay another layer of rock. And then this process being repeated of just looking at the landscape in maybe it's a completely different person that's sort of doing this interpretation. And then all the following eruptions sort of each leaving their mark. And they're sort of becoming a network of quarries and spaces around us as a bit of a sort of, let's say, not a monument, but definitely analog to what's living around these places is like, because most of these towns that were erased have just been rebuilt in pretty much the same place. So it's just sort of, I see this continuous aggregation as a way of sort of memorializing this.
Some beautiful, seductive images and you know, sort of beautifully crafted project. Sheila, John, comments or questions?
I felt like I was in a dream that occurred directly after Jasper's presentation. And I suppose that's what you meant when you, by your own introduction, that you were at a frontier between the city and the violent wilderness, which was how apparently Sydney Park was once understood, between the force of civilization and the forces of nature and the point at which they meet. There was an incredibly beautiful, dreamy moment when you went in January back up through the mists across that extraordinary landscape. It's funny that we were watching a film recently by Kurosawa where the people are scrabbling up a mountain. What's the name of that film?
Hidden Fortress.
Hidden Fortress.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
You could make friends with it if you're not already friends with it. I think that perhaps the dream overwhelms the project, you know what I mean? That the jagged, there's a very strong feeling about this jagged plan that you think will take time to excavate, and by the time it's excavated, it's a kind of sacrificial space that's ready for further infill by the next eruption. It's an invitation or something to be filled again. But I think that possibly the project is overwhelmed by the dream. I just wonder what you think about that.
I think, yeah, there is definitely a sort of, I think possibly that I confess that there were times where it felt a bit like it was moving in parallel but distant directions. And yes, there is quite a difficulty between what is actually the built space and the potential for further projects like this happening, one on top of the other and becoming a network. So
I think it's just hard to deliberately make ritualized space for a ritual that you also have to make the ritual. The sight of the gates of hell sounds a bit more terrifying than a bathhouse.
But I think they're similar simply because this project is a hole in the ground. And it's sort of hot, vaporous. So
I think, obviously, we must have all felt the resonance with what Yafo was talking about. And I did feel we were back in the world of a sort of blurring between real and invented places. I really enjoyed a lot of your presentation, the variety of media. I would say this has nothing to do with you aside. I think when we're reviewing student work, especially when it has these beautiful drawings and images, that the actual drawings and images should be in the room, or at least a panel representing them, because it's hard to discuss work that's been shown in PowerPoint. It has nothing to do with you, just to know to be argument. And I would like to have seen, you know, I think it's really interesting what size a drawing really is, you know, what size of those sections are huge, are they tiny? For me that would matter. So, sorry, again, not an aim at you. Yeah, I felt that, back to the content of your presentation, that you situated us in this amazing landscape which you described in a very interesting way that moved between kind of dreamy and very physical. Then I felt a kind of jump from the scale of the mountain into suddenly it was a plan of a building. And actually, I didn't even know where on the mountain that plan was situated. So I would have really liked to see almost back an image that went back to the view, the plan view, or the satellite view of the whole mountain. Just for me, it might only have been a spot, but just showing me a project was, because I felt I needed to understand its location. It sort of, which I think was a bit disappointing, because then became a project. It was, oh yes, it's a project for bathhouse. It's on kind of a cut site. And similarly, I was looking at that amazing image that's on the wall, and you talked about the concrete and the Roman concrete, the materials coming from near there. I suppose I would also like to see an image that maybe speculates about the physicality or the technology or the construction of how the concrete would meet or sit in the stone. You know, how, because I think in a way a project is about that. How do you, are you actually cutting the stone, and is the stone the container, or what's the role of the concrete and how does it work into it? So I suppose I'm looking for zoom out, where does the thing sit in that landscape, and zoom in, you know, how does the new material meet the old, which I suppose is more difficult for you maybe as a part-time student and given the time involved to engage with that, but it feels like that's part of your subject matter, and maybe you can react to it.
This ties into what I was discussing with John just now, that there are these two sort of sides to this project, and today I admittedly decided to present what, as now I have some distance from being a artist, I have been slightly more intrigued by the potential of sort of this process being repeated, rather than looking at this specific instance of just the 1944 flow and just this sort of configuration of spaces. So while this work has been developed, I have decided not to show it today, simply because what I'm trying to talk about, I chose to talk about today something that's slightly looking towards the future and reaches out deeper into it.
But if it's any encouragement or consolation or even discouragement from practitioners who could probably now no longer be described as emerging, your description of making work out of the aggregate of pre-existing conditions on the site, you know, we've been trying to do that all our life. So we did, you know, there's a life's work in that thought, I think.
I mean, David, seeing the imagery in the exhibition on the second floor gallery as chair of the jury, I mean, you must have been quite thrilled when you saw, you know, the sort of interrogation of you know, various media, and as I said, the quality of the imagery.
Yeah, it jumped out at us as immediately a strong project. There's an argument, I think, about materiality, and you know, and I think, you know, everybody in the room is kind of busting a gut really to get you to describe it as a Scarpa type project. You know, I mean, I can see the way the conversations go, and of course I think it's fair. But the reality is that actually we year on year get presented with very, very finite, complete, incredibly impressive, fully rendered bachelor's projects, which actually don't particularly take us into a world of their own. And I think the thing that commended it to the panel was that it created this world of its own. It's incredibly beguiling. Whether other people buy into that vision of how you start a design process, of course, is always open to question. And I do think Sheila flagged up an incredibly legitimate point, which is that if you're dealing with this undifferentiated landscape of pyroclastic flow, how do you actually make the first move to identify the point at which you hook the building into the landscape? And if I was being critical, and it isn't meant in a way that in any way undermines the process, I think there's a drawing there that actually establishes why it's there as opposed to there, if you see what I mean. Because it's a massive landscape. To me, the real strength of the thing actually is that what you do is you provide an architectural focus in the landscape which people are very, very intrigued by, as an antidote to what you described as the sort of trash tourist landscape. And you talked about decontamination of the cone. I thought that was a really interesting idea, and I think the project certainly does that. And it's the analytical drawing that says it has to be here rather than there. And then I think it's one move that actually embraces the materiality of it. But I think we need to put all the projects in the context of how and when they're produced. And certainly from the panel's point of view, this project really commended itself as having an individuality. What's an incredibly difficult problem?
He describes his method. He just in studio project, he says he's going to go out with all these masons and they're going to listen to the rock.
They're going to do it.
Listening to the rock, isn't that?
It's very precise. It's a wonderful process. I unfortunately haven't been to see it happen, but yeah, when using so that photograph of I think it's quite far back, but the sort of masons quarrying, they just insert wedges into small holes that they've made in the rock. And really, it's striking each pin with a mallet or with a hammer and listening to the pitch of the sound. That's how it's a musical process. It's fantastic. So I think that some of these spaces, yes, there can be a sort of preliminary analysis of what the intention is, but I think it's unfortunately it's quite. I feel like it's at a scale that requires further investigation, simply because decisions would have to be made on site depending on, is this rock going to crack 2 meters sort of further apart than what you'd expected? It's sort of picking up on these changes, which I don't think is necessarily something that would be expected to I don't know if it's something that's necessarily possible, but in terms of practical terms, but I think it just brings us back to sort of a very different way of doing this. I'm sure civilization before us were very comfortable.
So just outside of the project, I just thought to do anecdotally. Just thinking about the fact that Kingston broke the Bartlett domination that we've seen in the last 2 years, the school must have been quite thrilled with this.
Absolutely, and I want to take this opportunity to say that as everybody who has been there, winning these awards is not easy. Of course, primarily the effort is the students and the tutors who put lots of volunteers in it. And it's genuinely not at the level of the ordinary. It's not the effort at the level of quality assurance or towing the strategic line of the university's 5-year plan of excellence, excellence, and excellence. It takes much more than that. And I think that in these very difficult times that we see worldwide, and I think particularly in this country, about higher education, particularly in the arts, if schools like Kingston, relatively small and possibly cash-strapped, or more so than some other schools, are going to continue to rub shoulders with august institutions like the Bartlett and the University of Sydney, the same care and investment beyond the pale that the tutors show to their students and the students to their work needs to be shown by the institutions to the schools. So I am very happy that we got there, but I really hope we can stay there. And that's beyond me and Jane and Simon.
Good, thank you. We must move on. Thank you.